more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Sense of Beer Style, Julia and Jeremy here, and we can't wait to talk to you about Baltic Porter. We are, obviously, as all the beer styles that we cover, taking you through the Beer Judge Certification Program 2021 style guidelines on each of the beers listed. And we are now in the strong European beer category, which, wow, I'd like to linger there for days and weeks and have some fun and take a bath in, half of these beers. And we're in the last one of the category, the Baltic Porter. So I'm going to kick it off and then we'll get into sensory. And, Baltic Porter really does have a rich history. It was developed in separate countries, so the lore says in the style guidelines, particularly around the Baltic Sea area, and then became imported into England and then inspired a lot of porters. So this really was maybe, Jeremy, one of the first porters, not in England, but in the Baltic Sea area. And we've got, a history of different yeasts that were used. Top fermented, when you read the style guidelines, means ale yeast. And then bottom fermented is also a version meaning lager yeast that's added to this beer style. So the beer style, though, either way, don't get too hung up on the yeast, is more about the malt and the approach. And the main Baltic Porter is kind of a newer adaptation of cataloging this style of porter. And yet you've got these different regions in the world around the Baltic Sea having their own commercial examples, and we'll talk about that. It's basically, certainly medium to higher level, 7 to 8.5% alcohol. And you've got really dangerously good to drink, which is always a good thing to pay attention to, because if you have a few, don't drive home. And it's a truly malt-forward beer style. So with that, Jeremy, take us through the malts and all the typical ingredients.
Yeah, this is a fun style because we before we've talked about their ales, their lagers, and their hybrids. Well, this beer it oftentimes can be a hybrid. It's you can't assume one thing or the other. It's kind of fun. But we're going to start with a Munich or Vienna base, and they're going to use some black malt for color, maybe just a touch flavor, some debittered chocolate, because, as you said, this is a malt-forward beer. It's not about the bitterness. It's not about the roastiness. It's a very, very deceptively drinkable beer that, if you're not careful, can sneak up on you. I think you alluded to that. Oh, look at that. But they're also going to add different crystal malts to kind of bring out these flavors and these dried fruit flavors that we're going to talk about in a minute. But they're going to use a continental kind of German noble hops. These days, it's common for brewers to use a lager yeast with this, and that's kind of how the history began. The British sending their stouts and porters all throughout the world, and in the Baltic states they started making their own because they couldn't get it quite as often anymore. But they had lager yeast, so hey, let's use this, and so here you go. But it can be an ale yeast. But typically, if it is going to be an ale yeast, they're going to cold ferment it, just like they do in Cologne with a Kolsch and Dusseldorf with an alt beer, and that's where it becomes kind of a hybrid. So it could be an ale yeast or a lager yeast. Either way, there should be a pretty clean fermentation as a result of both the ingredient and the process, depending on which way they go with that. So Julia, you have a beer in front of you. Will you show it to us and tell us about the appearance for everyone listening?
So super quick on appearance, because I totally want to hover on aroma and flavor. I mean, style guidelines call for dark reddish copper to opaque dark brown. You're seeing that dark brown opaque. Opaque means really dense, can't necessarily see through it. And then thick, persistent tan color of foam. look at that. It's a little more aggressive than I would like. Maybe there's some age on my version, but there's tan colors. You can tell that it's not a white collar of foam. That has to do with some of the malt that Jeremy will talk to us about. And so it's got really beautiful color and a tan collar of foam. Let's get to appearance, though. I want to talk about, or forgive me, aroma, and then I want to talk about flavor.
Yeah, well, aroma. Every time, and sadly, I don't have one in front of me right now. I tried my best, but every time I have a Baltic Porter in front of me, I swear I can hear smooth jazz in the background somewhere because it's rich, it's smooth, it's malty, it's complex, but it's easy to drink at the same time. We're looking for a rich malt profile that can give you flavors and notes of caramel, toffee, nuts, deep toastiness, and even just a touch of licorice sometimes, and which is just a really phenomenal flavor to have just a touch of in these beers. It's complex, dark dried fruits, berries, and sometimes, especially if it's aged, it can also be a little bit kind of like, like how port is. It can just kind of have that refined elegance due to that you can only get from age. But these will never be burnt. They should never be burnt. If you have had or brew a Baltic Porter and it's burnt, I'm not going to say it's wrong, it's bad, but it's not typical. It's not when people are thinking, I want a Baltic Porter, they're not going for something burnt and acrid. The hops are there only to keep it in balance, but tasting the hops is minimal to none. But oftentimes you can get that little spicy note of alcohol, which you can feel in your nose. And to me, again, I've said this a few times, it almost reminds me of like a little bit of peppermint, just a little spicy pop that just kind of tickles my nose. That's what I expect out of a traditional Baltic Porter in the aroma. But you've been dying to go there, Julia. Take us to flavor.
So, and I'm going to be accountability buddy here too. Jeremy mentioned taste. You're not going to get anything taste in your aroma. Aroma is about the
Did I say
aromatic.
taste?
You are alluding to it, so I just want to make clear.
Okay.
So everything he said, and that's what's going to shorten my overview on the flavor. It's about the aromatic compounds, but you're not going to taste anything in that essence. And you're also, in Jeremy talking about, getting some esters, right? Esters can be strawberries, unripe raspberries, fruity notes, red fruit notes, stone fruit notes. That's only assuming if it's a ale yeast that's been used. So those two corrections there, or those two evolutions in your mind, and Jeremy, there's no correction, that's the wrong word, just to keep things deliberate, because I like to hold us in this space accountable for if we're studying for presenting the style based on the style guidelines. It might have lager yeast, so it might not have esters. And you don't, in sense of the flavor, you're not going to get towards any hops or anything in the aroma that you have to get those in the flavor. So in the flavor, in tasting bitterness, right, the bitterness of hops, this is not an aggressive bitter beer. So that's really important. But everything Jeremy said applies. I got nothing else. I mean, I don't even like licorice, Jeremy, but I like it in this beer. I don't like
same here.
the flavor profile of licorice. I avoid it like the plague, black licorice. But in a short
I like it in
beer,
my fennel and my Baltic Porters. That's about it.
It brings me beautiful notes. I'll also say that the style guidelines bring up the essence of black currants or dark dried fruits. That might be more from, if it's a ale yeast, than lager yeast in the flavor. And then it talks about the flavor being a smooth, finish on the palate. You're really more about starts malty sweet, but then finishes a little bit drier. Roasted coffee is another good one to add on to Jeremy's poetic, evolution of aroma to flavor, and those dark fruits. The bitterness is now going to come into play of medium low to medium, and those are going to balance that malty residual sugar. And you just don't want to expect this Baltic Porter to be cloying. That's the important part. And I think that's the gist, right? The hop flavor is really going to be medium low based on the style guidelines, if non-existent, and clean fermentation profile if it's a lager. So with all that on flavor, Jeremy, another component of flavor besides aroma and actual flavor of basic taste is mouthfeel. What do we got?
So this is going to be just quick and easy. I'm just going to, hit the center of the bullseye on mouthfeel for this. Baltic porters are typically very full-bodied. They're very smooth. You can feel the alcohol warmth, especially as they get stronger. And you can have a medium high carbonation. So you have that kind of assertive carbonation coming through, and that really helps. Um, take this complex beer and give it a little bit more kind of a presence of body, but helps kind of lighten the load too, if you will, if that makes sense. But on it from mouthfeel, let's just talk about style comparisons. I think that's a little bit more pertinent to people who are trying to differentiate. What is this beer like, and how do we tell the difference?
So hang with me, y'all, and thanks for passing the baton on that. Because style comparison, if you know your beer styles on the styles I'm about to mention, and total cheat, I know my stuff because I study the style guidelines. So I'm basically like reading from the style guidelines here. But it's really easy to dial in and describe what a Baltic Porter might be if you know your styles mentioned in the style comparison. So here we go. Combines the body maltiness, richness, and smoothness of a Doppelbock, right? The darker malt character of an English porter, the roast flavors of a Schwarzbier, and alcohol and fruitiness of an old ale. Wow. Much less roasted and often lower in alcohol than an imperial stout. If you know each of those styles that I just mentioned, and to study this, you would want to get each of those styles and then taste it against multiple classic examples of our Baltic. You are then going to be dialed in. But what a really neat description and way to get your brain to be right there. So, commercial examples.
Yes, I get the misfortune of pronouncing these. So the ones that are, basically, if you're going out into the world and you see a craft brewer, or you're at a bottle shop and you see Baltic Porter, just grab it, take it home with you, taste it, and get to know it. Ones to look out for if you're studying for BJCP or any level Cicerone, the Aldaris Porteris, the Devil's Backbone Danzig is, I believe they're out of Virginia, West Virginia,
Correct.
if I remember.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
right. They do a lot. I mean, you see them pop up in these guidelines often for a good reason. Baltica number 6 porter, the Okochim Mistrowski porter, Seinbertshoff porter, and of course the Zwick porter. Another one that I've also found that's not on this list is Komes, the Komes. If you're in a place with a bigger bottle shop, a Total Wine type of thing, typically they will have these beers available. They may not be in the best state because they're often on warm shelves, but at least you'll be able to find them. So just go out and find a Baltic Porter.
Yeah, and the Zwick Porter is from Poland, no doubt.
Yeah.
And many of what Jeremy just mentioned are from Russia. Again, the Baltic Sea region. But the U.S. versions, it's good to see, a Devil's Backbone mentioned in there, at least in the style guidelines. One of these days, this style is going to resurrect and have many more examples all across the land.
Yes, I can't wait for that day. So let's talk about vital stat. Let's talk about the beer by the numbers.
Sure. So original gravity 1060 to 1090, that always gives you an ode to potentially what your alcohol by volume would be.
Mm-hmm.
So if original gravity is 1060 to 1090, the ABV is 6.5 to 9.5% alcohol range. That's actually a big range, but good and easy to remember. And then final gravity is going to be higher in the mouthfeel, in the girth, in the residual sugar, 1016 to 1024. A lot of even numbers going on in that final gravity. That's an easy way that I can remember that. And then international bitterness units, which balances the residual sugar in that final gravity, 20 to 40, very broad range. 40 is getting more towards aggressive. 20 is barely, on the radar. And then standard reference method, or SRM, for color is 17 to 30. Think about dark beers being above 20 SRM. So you're getting into the dark brown range to the low, not quite fully black range. My style pretty much looks like light brown light black to dark brown. So 17 to 30 is somewhat easy to remember if you just think of it as 20 to 30, but you take a few points off, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
so
when it comes
next?
to drinking one of these things, the type of glass that if it were my house, I'd want to serve you in something like a tulip pint, which I happen to have an empty one here. That's frankly my favorite glass to drink almost anything out of. A pub mug, even like a no-neck pint, they've been known to serve these. Kind of depends on the strength. Frankly, if it's a stronger version, I'm going to want it in a snifter, in a tulip pint, something that I can swirl, I can brood over, I can smell, and it's not too much, because my goal is to taste this thing, not to forget what happened that night. So those are the glass types that I would hope to see this beer style in. It is definitely not a shaker pint. This is a special beer. But as far as temperature goes, my general rule of thumb is the darker it is, the stronger it is, the warmer I want it to be within that 40 to 50 degree range. So if you give me a Baltic Porter at just out of the fridge at 38 degrees, I'm going to sit there with my hand on the bulb of the glass and wait for a while before I really dive in. If you hand it to me at 45 degrees or above, then I'm a happy camper.
Yeah, all makes sense. And so let's talk pairing, right? Can I lead us off?
Absolutely.
On craftbeer.com, which is one of my cheats, and so many of the amazing people over the years that I've worked with contributed to that, including me. But this is from my coworkers: prime rib, aged Gouda, deconstructed s'mores. And I would say that list of entree, warm up act with the cheese of aged Gouda, and deconstructed s'mores is right in the vein of what a beer style like this, that is more like chocolate malt flavors as opposed to roasted, more acrid stout-like flavors, is going to be. And those foods are not so over the top intense. I can get you more intense in food suggestions. I love that repertoire, and just want to hear anything else Jeremy might want to add.
Well, and this is where, Julia, you and I could be great drinking buddies, because I also put Gouda on my list, because I think just the way like an aged, especially like a slightly smoked Gouda, just would really help this, not help this beer. This beer doesn't need any help. It would open this beer up in different interesting ways, with all the flavor profiles going on. For dinner, I'm thinking if I had this beer, I'm going to fix kind of like a beef stew, or maybe even like a pork mole, if we're thinking more Mexican, because I always love Mexican food. But for dessert, I'm thinking I want to try this beer with some pistachio ice cream and baklava. I think that would be fantastic.
Oh my gosh, you've got me going on baklava. And I think that's a good place to end, because I'm hungry for dinner. There you go. Baltic Porter, not commonly on the radar very much. Watch your freshness dates from imports. Encourage brewers wherever you live to brew them. But an incredibly rewarding beer, not over the top in ABV, and really worth your time to get to know.
Absolutely. Otherwise, and find one, drink one, enjoy it. Cheers.
Hear, hear.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
and me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.